Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education here at the Michael C. Carlos Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, those of you who are here in Ackerman Hall, and also those of you who are joining us on Zoom to today's Works on Paper Wednesday program. We're doing a series of Works on Paper Wednesdays in conjunction with a beautiful exhibition called The Mind, the Eye, and the Heart in honor of Clark Poling. Clark Poling was a beloved professor of art history, chair of the art history department, and former director of the Michael C. Carlos Museum, who passed away in September. And our curator of Works on Paper, Andy McKenzie, organized this show to recall the types of exhibitions that Clark would put together for students in Art History 102. So we hope that you will visit the Carlos and see the exhibition and also attend upcoming Works on Paper Wednesdays. Next week, Todd Cronin will be speaking about Andre Masson and Kandinsky and clay in the exhibition. And on March 3rd, Linda Narrow will be speaking about Whistler. Today, Andy McKenzie is going to look at a fascinating work by Romare Bearden and tell us about the work itself and also its interesting history and its connection to the Chicago Seven. So, Andy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So when I was organizing this show, it was a little bit difficult for me because I am not someone who had the great pleasure of knowing Clark Poling very well. I only worked with him on one program, and that was our Print Matters program. And it's a program where we bring works of art out for a small group of folks to be able to really get a good up-close look at works on paper. Specifically, for this particular one, we were looking at modernist prints. But what struck me about Clark, and this is just a little brief kind of background, was how gentle and kind he was, but also how excited he was to allow this opportunity for people to view works of art in person. And indeed, that is such a big part of the history of our collection. So it's really been a pleasure to bring these works of art together for this show. When you go into the show, because I'm sure all of you will find Romare Bearden's Mother and Child on the left-hand wall, our title wall, excuse me. It is the most brightly colored, most vibrant image in the show. And this is interesting to me because of the circumstances of its production. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll give a brief background on Romare Bearden and the works that we have in our collection, some of which, this one is the one that Clark was mainly involved in the acquisition for. But we have several others in our collection, and I'll kind of give a bit of a history of Bearden through those works. So just a little bit about this series. It was produced in 1971, and I think I should go through. Actually, no, we'll talk about Bearden first, and then we'll look at the rest of the images from this portfolio. But just in brief, the other images in this portfolio were created by a group of artists who were commissioned, but also volunteered their service to produce a portfolio of work to pay the legal fees for the Chicago Seven, formerly the Chicago Eight. We'll talk a little bit about why that number is smaller as we go through. But so they paid legal fees for the lawyers. What was interesting to me when I was researching this is that it's actually the lawyers themselves were involved in this group that raised money for legal fees for various groups across the country, mostly associated with charges, protest, rioting, things like that. All right. So let's look at a few. We'll look at a photograph of Bearden here. This is a great photograph of Bearden later in life in his studio in the 1980s. Bearden, you see in the first image that I showed you, mother and child, you see it's a lithograph, but I think you can definitely see his favored medium, which was collage. And you can see him here working on a collage that may have ended up as a print. So his favorite medium is collage. And as he progresses through his career, some of these become screen prints, some become lithographs, take various forms. Just a little bit about, Romare Bearden had a very interesting sort of trajectory as an artist. And I think that it speaks a lot to both his work and his life. The fact that he's not always the full-time artist, right? He sometimes has a full-time job during the day, and his thoughts on that are quite interesting. But always this idea of searching and journeying is really important for his work. He was born in Charlotte, moved to Harlem, and so here again, this idea of movement and journey and search is very, very important for him and very tied to his work. So we'll look at a couple images here. This print is from A Black Odyssey, and it is part of our collection. It's from the collection of Richard Long, a beloved professor here at Emory who passed away. We were able to acquire several works from his collection. They are, we were really lucky to do so, and I'll show you another one of those. Here's a work from what really we can say is Bearden's favorite medium of collage, and all of his works kind of take this form. Here you can see this is not just papers; it's mixed media. There's some paint on here, and this is likely a study for A Black Odyssey. This is the Trojan horse. So as I mentioned, he's moving back and forth from kind of moonlighting with art in Harlem. He himself was, well, let's just start out with his education. I watched this interview with him, and it was really, it was so interesting because he majored in math. He went into medicine. He was a third-year medicine student, came home and told his mother, who was a social activist, very prominent journalist in Harlem. He told her that he was not going to pursue medicine anymore. She said, well, you're throwing your life away. But he started to explore art after that. And also we have to say that though he did travel to Paris and met with several artists there in the 40s, he didn't really have any formal art training aside from his own commitment to formal art training. And that's an important point, I think, because he studied as a young man in New York. He studied works of art, and that's how he really thought it seems that you should learn. You should look at works of art. You can copy them. But in doing so, you're really kind of learning how to build a work. And again, that really speaks to collage as a method. Very literally, this idea of building a work of art in layers. And one fun anecdote or interesting anecdote that I heard also in this interview. He said that he didn't want to sit in the Met and just sit there and kind of copy images or work on images or learn these forms of other artists. He preferred instead to have a friend blow up these images for him, and they would be blown up in black and white, and then he would sit and copy those. And because he's doing it this way, he's not seeing the color. He's imagining his own color. And he said that was very formative for him, trying to figure out, well, okay, I'm building this, I'm building these layers, but I don't know what these colors are. But he says that it was a very important exercise for him. Just gonna move forward here. So we kind of know him for the later works that I just showed you. Screen prints, lithographs, collage, very brightly colored. But he also, when he first started out working, just doing drawings, he wasn't doing it necessarily for a full-time job again. He was very involved in social justice efforts. He produced the image that you see on the left for The Crisis, which was an activist journal, sponsored by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And both of these images, produced around the same time, we're speaking to the lack of jobs. We're speaking to unemployment. We're speaking to the fact that African Americans were unable to find jobs, even in the North. And so this is these cartoons, these political cartoons were really where he kind of began this foray into art. Okay, so back to mother and child. And I showed you those political cartoons because I think that they really enforce this idea of Bearden's interest in social justice. And so this opportunity to participate in this portfolio, which was the artists were all asked at in 1971 to produce a new work for this portfolio. And I'll show you a couple of other works that are also in our collection that came in under Clark's guidance that were also from this portfolio. They're incredibly different. Each one is very different. So again, this is, and they're all lithographs, but again, here we have a lithograph. I've seen this listed actually as lithograph, photolithograph, and screen print, and that's unless he reworked it later. That's not an accurate description. But really briefly, can I walk over there? Is that okay? Will I be off the? Okay. Okay, so I always walk around when I do these. It's uncomfortable up there. You can see, I think, why some have thought about this as a photolithograph. The head area and the mother and the child's eyes, the hands, the plump hands, the shading and tone there. They're very reminiscent of, sort of cut up photograph, right? Which Bearden did. He came home one day and from a meeting and saw one of his wife's sort of magazines and just started cutting things up. And that's where thank you. So again, I'm referring to this area here, the hands and the eyes. And then we have these areas here in the arm, the head, that really speak to collage and that speak to how Bearden is constructing this image. And here there's a really, really interesting layer of this lithograph where you can see the mouth of the mother. So you're getting all these multiple views, which is sort of a very modernist aesthetic thing to do. Okay, we'll walk back over. So this was produced with the lithography stone and also 7 zinc plates. And so that the number 7 is what's giving you the various layers and colors here. here are a few others from the series. And I think you'll be able to see that some of the artists really took this commission, Leanne Golub and Nancy Spiro on the right. They took this commission and wanted to contribute something that was very related to it. An image that was a very serious image, very sort of anti-police, anti-government. And so they're taking that sort of side. Other artists like Jack Beal, less so. And then we have Glyce Oldenburg, Robert Morris. Robert Morris contributes a conceptual piece, essentially. It's the idea of an observatory for seeing the pole star by night or day. On the left, you see a work by Larry Poons, who, if anyone has seen The Price of Everything on HBO, you will be familiar with Larry Poons. Many of these artists, too, I should say, served in the military. Mayor Bearden served in the military, Larry Poons as well. And so their contributions in that way are not so surprising why they might agree to make work for this series. On the right, you see Chicago Justice by Peter Saul. And at the top, you can see these letters that sort of phonetically give you the name Bobby Seale, who was one of the original Chicago 8 who were indicted, or who were charged, I'm sorry. So what ended up happening for the Chicago 7, I realize I haven't given you much background on that, and I'll do that now. These were protests, started out as peaceful protests, and really for the whole time did, right before the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. There were hundreds of people who congregated outside of the convention. And it was really kind of very sensitive, very charged, actually, time for, I think, just the country in general. It's, just after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And so it's a tense time. and several groups put out calls for, and some the calls are interesting. The calls are kind of funny. It's they say bring all your your barricade jumpers and your flag wavers, things like that. And it starts out with this kind of, I don't want to say party atmosphere, but an atmosphere of hope more so than it ended. But as more and more people congregated, there were throngs and throngs of people. The police began to advance. Everyone was getting very tense. Things were getting, and things started to kind of get out of hand. The police were aggressive. Many of the protesters, many of them activists, responded. And so, in the wake of this, a number of people are charged. These 8, there were 16 others aside from these 8 who had lesser charges. But these particular 8 were charged with crossing state lines with the intent to incite a riot. And what's interesting about this is that you think if these 8 are being charged, then these 8 must have some kind of connection, right? They must have been together. They must be conspiring together. But I want to just read this kind of description of the 8, and their names are David Dellinger, Rennie Davis, Tom Hayden, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and Bobby Seale. So Here is this description. It was an unlikely group to engage in conspiracy. Dellinger, at 54, had been active in pacifist movements for years before the rise of the student protests of the 1960s. Hayden and Davis were skilled organizers with focused political goals, and they'd never been interested in the street theater and cultural radicalism of Hoffman and Rubin. John Freunds and Lee Viner, who were charged with different crimes, were only marginally involved. The unlikeliest conspirator was Bobby Seale, who had never met some of the defendants until they were together in the courtroom, and who had appeared in Chicago briefly for a couple of speeches during the convention. Seale was one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, which federal and state prosecutors had recently targeted in numerous prosecutions around the country. So the 8 were linked less by common action or common political goals than by a shared radical critique of US government and society. And so with this statement, we kind of get perhaps why these particular individuals were charged, much less for what their activities and involvement actually was, and much more because they were higher profile and the government was interested in prosecuting them for other reasons. So the Chicago 8 become the Chicago 7 after Bobby Seale is, and here I'm going to show you this really powerful drawing from a court reporter from that trial. Bobby Seale speaks out in the courtroom about the legality of the charges, and others are supporting him. At one point, one of the other defendants blows a kiss at the judge. And the judge was kind of known to have a good bit of bias towards many, many different groups, including African Americans, including those that call themselves the Yippies, who were helping kind of organize some of these protests. And so after what he's then charged with with contempt of court, and after that he's separated and then appears alone as a defendant and speaks out again. And when he does, the judge has him bound and gagged and ties him to a chair. And here you can see in this drawing by Howard Brody, and this is from, I should say also that this is from the Library of Congress. And I totally am including all of their information on here because I think it's important for the object. By Howard Brody, who was a court reporter there. And you can see Bobby Seale kind of furiously trying to write notes as he's been tied and gagged. Now, this is something that is public knowledge. There's an outcry about it, about mistreatment of all the defendants, and especially Bobby Seale. And so I want to look again at this piece by Bearden. Bearden had been a champion of social justice, and I think that beyond the figures in his imagery, I think that in this case, perhaps there's some pointed imagery. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And in doing so, kind of bring in the sort of obvious connections with this image, mother and child. But Bearden, with this incredible amount of knowledge of the history of art that he had attained over the years, would have been very familiar. And I'm going to draw a little bit on some of the things, interestingly, that Walter Mellion talked about last week. He would have been very, very familiar with other images of, say, the Virgin Child, the Madonna and Child, and various types of this imagery. So here I'm going to point out a couple more things before we compare to other images. Again, you see here the child's face, and the child is looking out. If you look really closely, the child is actually looking directly at the viewer and is addressing the viewer, while the mother figure looks down. And her expression is not the one of sort of calm that you see in many mother and child images. It's more of a sorrowful sort of expression that's also very common for these images. But the child glances out at the viewer, really more than glances, directly engages with the viewer. And yet his hand here is raised. And when in images of the Virgin and Child, the hand is raised, it's often kind of a playful movement. It's a sweet movement. Often the child is touching the cheek of the mother, or in some cases is playing with something the mother is holding. But I think here it's important to bring in the story that Bearden told. Each artist was asked to supply a statement and a bio for these images. And Bearden's was very different than the others. Many just simply gave a bio where their art had appeared and left it at that. Some, like Golub and Spiro, sort of dedicated their work to friends that had been arrested and charged with a crime related to protesting or activism. But Bearden told a story about his childhood. And I think that it's so telling. It's difficult to, I'm going to preface it by saying it's difficult to kind of know what he was going for, or if this is directly related to the image. But it's very evocative of the way he often described his work, and particularly when it's a work that has a little bit of extra emotional sort of meaning for him. He often goes to anecdotes about his childhood. And so he spent part of his time in Harlem. He spent part of his time in Charlotte with his grandparents in the summer. And often he'll go to anecdotes about this time in Charlotte. And this is one of those times. So he says, and I won't read the whole thing, but he's basically telling the story about how he loved very much this tiger lily that his grandmother had in the garden. And it was this beautiful flower, and he loved it. He thought of it as his own. He went out and looked at it every day. And then one day it wasn't there. And there was just the only remnant was the stem. And he recalls seeing the stem and seeing the top, it was broken. And something very important to him now was missing. And he says his grandfather came out and saw that he was upset, and knew why he was upset, and told him that, okay, well, your grandmother, she cut a lot of flowers from the garden today. She's going to take them to church, and it'll grow back. It'll grow back. His grandfather touches the dirt around the flower and says, it's gone now, but it will return. But this was a very, it reads as a very heightened moment of loss for Romare Bearden as a boy. And I think, look up here one more time. If again, you kind of see this, and again, the story is directly this is the story that Romare Bearden gave to be included in this portfolio alongside this image, and was so very different that it's one of those things that you read and you see, you try to relate to the image, and it's almost impossible to do. But in that being impossible to do for the viewer, you hit on one of the things that was so very important to Bearden, and that is leaving something out that the viewer has to find for themselves. The viewer has to finish the work, as so to speak. Not that his works were unfinished, but they were left in such a way that the viewer could enter and could find their own story within it. And hear this sort of gentle hand reaching up, the gentle hand maybe reaching for a flower, this direct contact with the viewer of the child. Anytime we see direct eye contact with the viewer, that individual is engaging. This is an act of engagement with the artist, with the image. And it's often this opportunity that the artist is giving to kind of read deeper into the image. And I think that this is definitely one of those scenarios. So we're going to look quickly at a couple of other Virgin Mary images. One that is actually in the show that Walter spoke about last week, but also by two artists that we know that Romare Bearden looked at and whose work that he very much appreciated, in so much that he, when he talks about Rembrandt and he talks about Albrecht Dürer, who we'll look at next, he said, you can't create, oh, it's Van Eyck. You can't create a Van Eyck or a Dürer anymore because nobody has the patience, because art moves so quickly that an artist trying to recapture that sort of thing, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because we don't have the patience. But Romare Bearden looked to Rembrandt. He looked to Van Eyck. He looked to a number of different early modern artists, particularly Dutch artists and German artists, some Italian. And so when we're looking at the mother in Romare Bearden's work, and we're looking at the Virgin on the right of Rembrandt, you see a difference. You see the mother, Romare Bearden's mother and child, her eyes are looking down. These are kind of, they really evoke specific kind of types of the motif of the Virgin and child. And here we have a very sorrowful mother in Rembrandt's etching. And we have even a child that is very sorrowful. And in Bearden's, though Rembrandt's version here, the Christ child is not looking out at the viewer. And in Romare Bearden's, the child is actually looking directly out at the viewer. In both cases, the idea of sorrow is very apparent. The Virgin in Rembrandt's face, her expression, the softness of her expression, very sorrowful. And the very serious Christ child, very sorrowful, very serious. And here we'll look at Albrecht Dürer. These are both in our collection. There are several other types of Virgin and child, and several that have this hand up, which I'll show you in a minute. But kind of what I'm getting at is he's really combining several different types. And I think that is very evocative of how he built his work, how he built an image, kind of from the ground up in these layers. And here again, you see where collage might have been sort of the best way to sort of literally describe this building up of an image. In Durer's engraving on the right, we see the Virgin again here, in this case, in contrast to Rembrandt's. Rembrandt's is looking off in a sorrowful manner. This Virgin is looking down, more like Romeo Bearden's mother. The baby here has his eyes closed, a sleeping, sort of peaceful feeling to it. Whereas, again, in Bearden's Mother and Child, it's less of a peaceful feeling and more of an engagement with the viewer. This idea of as this child looks out and recognizes you as the viewer, the idea being that the viewer is to engage with this image and sort of look harder for deeper meaning. And this one, this image of Virgin and Child, it's by Del Sarto. It's in the collection of the Boston MFA. And this is one of those images that is so very, it's a different feel from the other two. And it's a type where the Christ child is happier. He's playing. And again, often when you have this raised hand, the Christ child seems at peace, seems happy, is usually playing even, or grabbing at the breast of the Virgin. But it's a very tender kind of image. And here we see the child actively engaging the viewer, much like in Bearden's Mother and Child. And I show you these images to kind of underscore that Bearden, in building this image, I think the term of building is really apt for his works. In building this image, he's looking at other motifs, he's looking at other types, and has seen so many of these. And I think that for its place in the series, The Artist as Witness, it's a very kind of obvious connection in that the child is looking at you, you're witnessing. But there's also this sense of an innocence sort of lost or never really had, this kind of tragic, if we're looking at the Virgin and Child of Christianity, this kind of acknowledgement of future loss, an acknowledgement of hardship. And I think Romeo Bearden's also drawing on those concepts for this image. And again, for this specific purpose. This idea of, American citizens, we can peacefully gather, we can sort of rise up, we can let our opinions be known. And yet the trial of the Chicago Seven was complete sham. The charges were dismissed against both the Seven and Bobby Seale. And I think that this image, perhaps more so than some of the others in the series, really asks the viewer to engage with this thought, to engage with the idea of an idealistic child who walks out in the garden one day and finds that this flower that he has loved for the flower's life is gone. And that certainty that it would be there, that certainty of safety, or the idea of safety, and sort of this idealistic notion of life is then kind of ripped out from under you. And so I think that, and especially, I keep going back to this hand, especially that hand, that gesture really contrasts with that direct look of the child at you, but also has so many multiplicity of possible meanings. It could be read as playful. It could be read because of, it could be read as the Black Panther fist, because it's very related to Bobby Seale. But there's just such a multiplicity of meanings. And again, I think that the viewer, what's really happening is he's asking the viewer to engage in those multiplicity of meanings through this direct eye contact of the child. So does anyone have any questions about the series or this work? I can talk a little bit more about the lithography process, because I think that is such a complicated process when you're using these 7 plates, the stone plus the 7 plates, that that's kind of, it's interesting that this was the chosen medium. Sure.
We're going to stop the sharing in order to see the chat. Andy, there's a question. Are the bearded figures masked?
The mother and child. You do see, and I'm not a Bearden scholar by any means. I am familiar with his work, but most of what I know about Romare Bearden and his body of work is from reading the work of others, Mary Schmidt Campbell and Cheryl Finley, and so I can't say for certain if they are masked. What I would say, do we have? When we see the child figure, the child figure especially looks masked. I think that more what this kind of mask-like form is doing is kind of emphasizing more the sort of multiplicity of being, perhaps the multifacetedness. Romare Bearden is very well known for depicting sort of this the multifaceted nature, limitless nature of African American identity in his work. And rather than viewing this image in particular as masked, that's more the way that I would read it, kind of this multiplicity of meaning. And multifaceted meaning in that particular image.
Andy, I'm curious, he specifically does not call this version a new sign of divinity.
Right.
So I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, that's true. He very specifically calls it mother and child, which speaks to, contemporary familial connection. And it is like, it will read, I mean, the obvious, for many who are looking at this image, the kind of obvious connection would be to Madonna imagery, but it's also kind of the tightness of a family bond, which he brings in. He himself, in his own words, that he was a religious person, but not in the going to church sort of way. so I do think that that meaning is in there, but I also think that this idea of a familial bond, protection and security that can be lost and found again and lost again in relationships, familial relationships. I think that too is part of it. And I do think he's kind of sort of pushing back at the idea of the Madonna and child.
Well, thank you. And I apologize for our technical issues today. I hope they're actually probably more here in the room than they are on Zoom. So thank you so much for joining us today, and hope to see you back next week for Todd Cronin for Works on Paper Wednesday, and also this Saturday at 4, Professor Rune Nyord from the Art History Department will be giving a lecture about his recent research on 3 different Middle Kingdom coffins from a suit in the College Museum collection. So thank you so much. It's completely frozen. So I can't seem to stop the webinar, nor can I. Sure, I'm going to go downstairs and stop the webinar from downstairs. So you keep talking down here. I don't know why this computer is